started getting these vivid visions. And from the very first exercise, there was these vivid visions that I started getting. And that workshop was very small. We were just 6 of us. And I was the person who was having the most experiences in that workshop. And I started having these very, very profound experiences. So at the end of the day, I could see myself in this one regression session that we did. I saw myself as a small child, a boy in ancient Greece. I was wearing a toga and running around and all that, very carefree. And then eventually, in that same lifetime, I saw myself in jail and wearing a lot of chains on my body and very dirty feet. And I always had a problem with my feet being dirty. So I would have this compulsion to wash them all the time. And I saw my feet very dirty in that lifetime, and I had no way to clean them. I was in jail and I was in a lot of pain. And that is all I could see in that life. And after that, the regression ended. And then it was time for me to go home. And I was super happy that I had not expected to see anything. And this was a lot that I had seen. And I went and told my husband that he'd come to pick me up. So I told him that it was a very fruitful day. And even if I don't encounter anything the next day, the workshop has been successful. And that is what I told him. And we went home, and I came back the next morning. And the very first session that we had the next morning was something that I can never forget in my life. And we were told to identify a body part and stay with the body part and see whether there is a story associated with that body part. So that is what I started with. And I've always had migraines. So I started with my head, and I kept concentrating on my head and seeing whether something happens. And the more I tried to concentrate on the head region, the more the pelvic area started aching a lot, like menstrual cramps. I started getting these very, very bad cramps in my pelvis. And I was like, okay, let's go with the flow and see what this is trying to tell me. And as soon as I went towards my pelvis and I started being in surrender mode, I immediately saw a lifetime where I was a prostitute somewhere in erstwhile Bangladesh, which was a part of India also at that time. And I was a young girl of maybe 23, 24. And I was sold into the trade very, very young in my life, very early in my life. And I used to have these unsafe sexual practices. I was very, very poor. The area that I lived in was very, very dirty and unhygienic. And the people who used to run this operation, the brothel owners, they would never allow me to be pregnant. Whenever I used to get pregnant, they used to abort the child using very primitive methods. Like I used to see vinegar and acid and things like that being inserted into the vagina to clean off the baby and kill it off. And very primitive methods were used, because of which the reproductive system eventually started getting destroyed. But they didn't care. They just wanted the money that was being brought because of the work that I was doing. Eventually, so this was what happened in the first session. And then we took a break, and the masters asked us whether we should go for a tea break. And I was like, no, 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 we have to go for the next session immediately, because there was something which was left unsaid, or maybe something which was left incomplete. And they listened to it, and they immediately took us into the next regression, where again I went back to the same lifetime, and I saw myself pregnant this time. And I realized that they have not been able to abort this pregnancy, and they have been unsuccessful. Now again, the brothel owner that I saw in this lifetime was my mother from this current lifetime. So and the helpers also that were there with her were very, very similar with the ones that I had seen during my tribal lifetime at home, if you all remember. So I was a little intrigued. And then eventually, in the process, I saw myself in labor pains, and I experienced a little bit of those labor pains. And the masters, they facilitated it beautifully, and I was brought out of it, and I realized that I had died giving birth to that child. I have no memory of whether that child survived or not, but the trauma that had been associated with my reproductive system through that lifetime was so great that in my dying moments I had this thought that I can't do this anymore. I can't, because I have been through a lot and I just need a break, and I need my reproductive system to rest for some time. And I'm not doing this for my next lifetime. And I instantly realized that why I had chosen to not have babies, and why there were so many congenital defects that were found in my reproductive organs while we were undergoing tests. And then eventually the question started coming to my mind that why am I seeing my mother in all these lifetimes where she's taking away my babies, or she's instrumental in killing my babies, when in this lifetime she has been a very loving mother, and she has been instrumental in getting me my baby this time. So this was a question that started running in my mind, and I asked the masters also, but they were like, no, you have to stay with this question and you will get your answer eventually. And I got my answer. And I got my answer in such a beautiful way that I can't describe in words, because eventually in the next few sessions I saw myself as a serial killer. I was a boy in France, in ancient France, and my mother, who is also mother in my current life, she used to beat me up a lot because she was poor and she did not have enough money. She had many children, and she used to beat me up as a boy. And one day, out of rage, out of retaliation, I kill my mother and I gut her out. Like, I use a knife and I gut everything, all her innards out, and that gives me a lot of peace. And eventually what happens is I start looking for women who look like my mother, and I do the same thing to them. And then eventually in another regression session, I saw myself as a sarpanch in somewhere in Haryana, where I was very, very well built and very good to look at. And I saw my mother as my wife. I was never good to her. I used to indulge in sexual activities with her without her permission. And I had many other sexual partners in that lifetime. And I never had any regard for any woman that was there in my life. And in that lifetime, I died out of paralysis. And while I was in paralysis, my wife, who I had mistreated all my life, was still devoted to me, still very, very loving towards me, and she was very caring. She cared for me during the years that I had paralysis, and I eventually died of that. So when I put together these lifetimes, I could see that there were some lifetimes where I was the victim, and my mother was the perpetrator. But then there were some lifetimes where I was the perpetrator and my mother was the victim. And how in this lifetime we've chosen the most close relationship as a mother and daughter, and come here as a mother and daughter to heal the baggage of those past lives. And when I saw this story, this circle, this cycle getting complete, it was like a huge weight had been lifted off me. And eventually, from the prostitute lifetime, I had in that lifetime there were a lot of bugs that were there in my house. So there used to be bug bites all around my body in that lifetime. And after the workshop, those bug bites actually came to me in this lifetime. And this is something which is very rare, which happens. And it took me around 20-25 days, and the masters were kind enough to guide me through the whole thing while everything healed and settled down. And I finally had the answer to my questions.